So typically there are 3 or 4 questions I get asked pretty much all the time. The first one is the most basic one, which is somebody comes in and says, my customer has a concrete floor, it's become a bit dull, they want to restore the shine, what do I do? Sometimes you get the more involved question where somebody comes and says, well, my customer has a floor that's cracked and chipped, with scratches all over the place, it's very dull, it needs to be restored and brought back to a shine. What do I do? And the third question, which is a little bit more common these days, is one where the customer comes and says, my floor, I've used wax on my floor historically, but I don't want to do that anymore. What's the process by which I remove the use of wax and get my floor to shine? So when I get asked these questions of, how do I restore the floor, there are 3 things I ask the customer. The first thing I ask them is, does the floor that you're going to be working on have some kind of a topical coating? And the topical coating could be like wax, or it could be a water-based sealant, or it could be an epoxy. But does it have a coating on it? The second question I ask them is, what is the condition of the floor? Is it scratched and cracked? Is it just dull? What is the existing condition? Because you need to know that. And then the third question I ask them is, how much money does your customer want to spend? Because really that will determine how much time and effort and what kind of tools you can use to work on that floor. Because floors are such that you could spend tons of money to try and bring something to a final shine, but if you don't have it, there are other ways to get almost there. So let's address these 3 questions. Okay? The first question was, does the floor have a coating? And the reason why that's important is the way you address the floor is going to be based on whether it has a coating or not. So let's assume that the answer is yes, it does have a coating. If that coating is some kind of water-based sealant, or it's a coating that you do not wish to remove, then the best way to clean and shine that is simply by using water and some kind of detergent. So essentially a mop and a bucket or an auto scrubber to clean the floor. And then if you want to get it to a little bit of a shine, you can buff it. But using anything more abrasive will cause more dullness in that coating. So you don't want to do that. So if it already has a coating, the best way to do it is to clean it and buff it, and that's it. The second part is, if it does not have a coating, or if that coating is to be removed, what do we do? So typically, if there is no coating, and the condition of the floor, which is the second question, the condition of the floor is such that it's just dull and doesn't have major scratches or damage to the floor, then the best way in which to bring back the shine is to use something called an astropad or a diamond impregnated pad. Astropads are lighter than resin pads, but they could be used either on a swing machine or an auto scrubber, and can be used on a consistent basis to bring the shine back to the floor. So it's not something that you do as a project necessarily, but you make it as part of your day-to-day routine to ensure that as you are cleaning the floor, you are also using this astropad to bring back the shine over time. And that's probably the best way to get a floor that's just generally dull, not damaged or scratched, but just generally dull, back to a shine. And the level of shine will depend on what the customer wants. Typically, if you're looking for a matte or honed finish, you're looking at an 800 or 1500 grit astropad. If you're looking for something a little bit more shiny, maybe you go for a 3000 or a 6000 grit astropad. So in the case where you've got a floor which does not have a topical coating and is scratched or has a lot of damage to it, you would have to take perhaps a more involved approach or process. One of the things you would want to do is to make sure that if there are major cracks or holes or gouges in the floor, that you want to patch them first. And before you do any kind of polishing or grinding, you want to make sure you've filled in any big holes, obviously with the customer's consent. But once you have done that, then you would approach this perhaps using tools like diamond resin pads. And they look like these guys here. They come in a variety of grits. And you would use those instead of the astropads in order to get the floor back to a shine. And the way that works is you have to determine, based on the condition of the floor, what grit you're going to start at. So let me take a sidestep here and explain that resin diamonds, like metal diamonds, like others, come in different levels of grits. But the resin diamonds come usually in the widest range of grit, typically starting at around 50 grit and going sequentially, that's 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, 1500, 3000 and higher levels of grit. So this range of diamonds that are available to us are what we would use for any project. But the trick here is to determine where do you start. And the starting level depends on the condition of the floor. So the worse the scratches, the deeper the scratches, the lower the grit you want to start at. So if it's really bad, you perhaps want to start at a 50 grit. But if the floor has light scratching and no gouges, you might want to start at a 200 grit. The second question you have to ask yourself is, where do I end? And the end is determined more by what the customer wants. If the customer is looking for a honed finish, as you mentioned earlier, 800 grit or 1500 grit is enough. If you're looking for more of a reflective finish, a gloss finish, you want to go up to maybe 3000 or 6000 grit. Finding the right starting point and ending point are the first steps in the process. Once you've determined that, then you have to go through the steps sequentially and patiently and carefully in order to get the best results at the end. So to illustrate this, so perhaps you've identified that 200 grit is the right level to start at and 1500 grit is where you want to stop. That means you have to go through 200, 400, 800 and end at 1500. That's 4 steps of grinding or polishing that you'll be doing sequentially and patiently and following one step after the other. And once that's done, you can do a light clean and buff in order to get the final finish that you're looking for. So let's address the third point. So the first point, just to recap, was we ask ourselves the questions, is there a coating or no topical coating on the floor, because that will determine how we proceed. And then the second question is, what is the condition of the floor? And that will determine what kinds of tools we use. The third question you need to ask, as we've said before, is what's the budget? How much money do we want to invest in this? And whether it's ourselves or the customer, it's a key question because there are ways in which you might be able to get something close to what you want without necessarily having to go through all the steps. So something that's good enough may enable us to save some money, whereas if you wanted to do it properly, it may cost you more than you have. But regardless, by knowing the budget, you can manage both expectations and the process that you need to follow. So the second big question we were going to address today was, how do I prepare a concrete floor for a topical coating? And let me paint 2 scenarios for you here. Like, one scenario is where you already have a coating, you need to remove it and get it ready for the replacement coating, whether it's the same coating or something else. Or you've got a situation where you've got a floor that's never been coated with anything before and you're preparing for the first time for a coating. So before you do anything, the first question you ask yourself is, what does the manufacturer of the coating you want to use recommend the floor be like? Because different types of coatings require different prep. Epoxy typically requires a rougher finish so that there's proper bonding between the epoxy and the concrete. If you're using a water-based sealant, on the other hand, perhaps you don't need it as rough and it could be a finer finish. So it really is important that you look at the requirements of the coating you wish to use to determine what the condition of the floor needs to be. So that's the first question you need to ask. Once you've determined what you need the floor to be like, you can now pick the right tools in order to get there. So let's talk really about the first scenario, which is I've got a coating, I need to remove it and get the floor ready for the next level of coating. So let's say you've got a coating like epoxy or a water-based sealant. The best way to remove those is by using either a carbide or a metal bonded diamond tool to scratch the surface and remove the coating. So sometimes it flakes off, sometimes it requires a little bit more aggression, but really you want to use an aggressive tool to remove the coating. You want to bite into the concrete. And if your next step is an epoxy coating, then the removal process alone will create a rough enough surface for you to apply the epoxy, so you don't really need to do much else. However, if you end up having to make the floor finer because you're using a water-based sealant that requires the floor to be finer, you may need to go through the similar process we talked about earlier, where you pick a certain level of resin diamonds, perhaps using 100 grit, 200 grit, and stopping at a 400 grit to give you a honed, kind of rough-ish finish to allow you to put the coating on. But again, that is determined by the manufacturer of the coating you wish to use. But using the metal bonded diamonds first and then using resin diamonds to get it up to the level you want, the fine level that you want, is probably the right approach to take in the case where you're removing a coating and then replacing that coating. In certain circumstances, you don't need to remove a coating because it's the first time you're doing a coating. Or maybe you had wax on the floor and you've stripped the wax and now you're back at the bare floor. In circumstances like that, again, knowing the condition the floor needs to be in order to receive the coating is the key step. And once you know that, then you would apply either a metal bonded diamond or resin diamonds to create the roughness that is desired in the floor. Here are some pro tips. The first is understand the material that you're working with. Because while we all maybe think of concrete as one ubiquitous mass, really it is not. There are different types of concrete. Concrete come in different hardnesses, and that's perhaps key to understanding how long it's going to take you to do the work. The softer the concrete, the faster the work gets done. The harder the concrete, the longer it takes. And that's important. The other part that's important about the concrete is to know whether it has a topical coating or not. So that's something that's key in this process. And then the third is to truly understand the condition of the floor. So inspect the entire floor that you're working on and have a sense of what it's going to take to get that floor into the kind of condition that you want. So once you know these, not only will you be able to pick the right tools for the job, not only will you be able to efficiently complete the work, but you probably make more money because you'll be able to quote more effectively to the customer. So pro tip number 2, when working with materials like concrete or natural stone, the behavior of the material is different depending on the environment, depending on what it's made of, where it's from in the case of natural stone. And so in those circumstances, it's important to be patient. When you're working with these kinds of materials, be patient, especially if you've not worked with it a lot before. Be patient, learn from the work that you're doing. Take the time to understand how the material behaves under different conditions, whether using a metal tool or a resin tool, to understand how the floor is behaving and learn from that. Because remember, this process is an art. This kind of work is an art. And it's only by taking the time to understand what's going on with the tools that you have that you'll be able to actually learn and improve on the projects in the future. Our third project is choose the right equipment and tools for the job. I found sometimes that customers will not want to spend the extra money to buy an extra set of diamonds, for example, an extra kit of diamonds. And it hurts them in the future. They have to come back and redo the work, and it just doesn't make sense. So it's better to have a nice full toolkit. So you have the right tools for the job, depending on the circumstance, which you may discover along the way. And having the right equipment is also key. Don't use just any old machine. Pick the machine that's designed to do the work that you want to do. And in that way, you'll be more efficient, more productive, and you'll make more money.